Welcome back. We've seen the roots of decline in the rule of kings, Solomon, Rehoboam, Jeroboam and Ahab, even with prophet after prophet calling them back to God. Now we move forward to the 7th century BC, focusing on particularly the northern kingdom. At the end of centuries of spiritual decline, the Lord acts, using the Assyrian Empire and destroying the northern kingdom and deporting the people of Israel away to faraway countries. In any formal or organised sense, they never actually returned. Instead, the Assyrians fill the land with people from faraway places elsewhere in their kingdom. They intermarry with the people of Israel left behind in the land. And throughout this period, we observe a particular kind of sin that is very much at the heart of the spiritual decline of God's people. And this same sin is something that Christians today need very much to defend themselves against. To find out what it is, let's turn to the text of 2 Kings chapter 17. In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea, son of Elah, became king of Israel in Samaria, and he reigned 9 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, but not like the kings of Israel who preceded him. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up to attack Hoshea, who had been Shalmaneser's vassal and had paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria discovered that Hoshea was a traitor, for he had sent envoys to So, king of Egypt, and he no longer paid tribute to the king of Assyria as he done year by year. Therefore Shalmaneser seized him and put him in prison. The king of Assyria invaded the entire land, marched against Samaria, and laid siege to it for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria. He settled them in Halah, in Gozan on the Habor River, and in the towns of the Medes. All this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who brought them up out of Egypt from under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods and followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them, as well as the practices that the kings of Israel had introduced. The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. From watchtower to fortified city, they built themselves high places in all their towns. They set up sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. At every high place they burned incense, as the nations whom the Lord had driven out before them had done. They did wicked things that aroused the Lord's anger. They worshipped idols, though the Lord had said, "You shall not do this." The Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and seers. "Turn from your evil ways, observe my commands and decrees in accordance with the entire law that I commanded your ancestors to obey, and I delivered to you through my servants the prophets." But they would not listen, and were as stiff-necked as their ancestors, who did not trust in the Lord their God. They rejected his decrees and the covenant he had made with their ancestors and the statutes he had warned them to keep. They followed worthless idols and themselves became worthless. They imitated the nations around them, although the Lord had ordered them, "Do not do as they do." The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cuthah, Avar, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and settled them in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites. They took over Samaria and lived in its towns. When they first lived there, they did not worship the Lord, so he sent lions among them, and they killed some of the people. It was reported to the king of Assyria, "The people you deported and resettled in the towns of Samaria do not know what the God of that country requires. He has sent lions among them which are killing them off, because the people do not know what he requires." Then the king of Assyria gave this order: "Have one of the priests you took captive from Samaria go back to live there and teach the people what the God of the land requires." So one of the priests who had been exiled from Samaria came to live in Bethel and taught them how to worship the Lord. Nevertheless, each national group made its own gods in the several towns where they settled, and set them up in the shrines the people of Samaria had made at the high places. They worshipped the Lord, but they also appointed all sorts of their own people to officiate for them as priests in the shrines at the high places. They worshipped the Lord, but they also served their own gods in accordance with the customs of the nations from which they had been brought. To this day they persist in their former practices. They neither worship the Lord, nor adhere to the decrees and regulations, the laws and commandments that the Lord gave the descendants of Jacob, whom he named Israel. When the Lord made a covenant with the Israelites, he commanded them, "Do not worship any other gods or bow down to them, serve them or sacrifice to them, but the Lord who brought you up out of Egypt with a mighty power and outstretched arm is the one you must worship. To him you shall bow down, and to him offer sacrifices. You must always be careful to keep the decrees and regulations, the laws and the commandments he wrote for you. Do not worship other gods. Do not forget the covenant I have made with you, and do not worship other gods. Rather, worship the Lord your God. It is he who will deliver you from the hand of all your enemies." Well, Israel did it, and the replacement Samaritans did it too. Syncretism, mixing true worship with false, was part of the beginning, the middle and the end of Israel's decline into exile. But is it something that Christians need to defend ourselves against? We think ourselves as far too sophisticated to worship God and at the same time worship Baal and Buddha and Bacchus. But syncretism is a very subtle thing, and worshipping God while sneaking a bit of idolatry in on the side is even slipperier. In Colossians 3 verse 5, Paul writes, "Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry." In other words, to follow our wrong desires and passions is actually a form of worship, false worship. Our pre-Christian self, our earthly nature, came already messed up with passions and desires directed at things that were substitutes for God. And now, if we give ourselves to these old lusts, we ask God to share the same stage as our sex lives or our materialism. That's syncretism. It doesn't greatly matter whether it's money, sex, or power that you grasp for. The Christian needs to put that urge to death. And most wonderfully, Paul goes on to assure the Colossians God has given us a new self, which is constantly being renewed in the image of its Creator. And so what we do in Colossians 3:12 is this: as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with one another and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. We don't kill off the old nature in a vacuum. Just as Shalmaneser made sure that new inhabitants came into Samaria after he'd taken the best of the Israelites, we replace the old with the new. Sexual immorality, lust, and greed are replaced with compassion, kindness, humility, forgiveness. And over all these virtues, binding them all together in perfect unity, is love. The Christian defence against the trap of syncretism is the pure worship of God as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, untainted by our old earthly nature. We are to set our hearts and minds to discipline our thoughts on things above, adopting the virtues of God's character, crowned by his love, thereby pushing out and replacing entirely any other idols.